Section 19 of a series of lessons in Raja Yoga. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marian Servasi. A series of lessons in Raja Yoga by Yogi Ramacharaka. Section 19. The eighth lesson. The Highlands and Lowlands of Mind. Part 2. Many writers have related the process by which the unconscious mentation emerges gradually into the field of consciousness, and the discomfort attending the process. A few examples may prove interesting and instructive. Maudsley says, "It is surprising how uncomfortable a person may be made by the obscure idea of something which he ought to have said or done, and which he cannot for the life of him remember. There is an effort of the lost idea to get into consciousness, which is relieved directly the idea bursts into consciousness." Oliver Wendell Holmes said, "There are thoughts that never emerge into consciousness, and which yet make their influence felt among the perceptive mental currents, just as the unseen planets sway the movements of the known ones." The same writer also remarks, "I was told of a business man in Boston who had given up thinking of an important question as too much for him. But he continued so uneasy in his brain that he feared he was threatened with palsy. After some hours the natural solution of the question came to him, worked out, as he believed, in that troubled interval." Dr. Schofield mentions several instances of this phase of the workings of the unconscious planes of the mind. We mention a couple that seem interesting and to the point. "Last year," says Dr. Schofield, "I was driving to Fillmore Gardens to give some letters to a friend. On the way, a vague uneasiness sprang up, and a voice seemed to say, 'I doubt if you have those letters.' Conscious reason rebuked it and said, 'Of course you have, you took them out of the drawer specially.' The vague feeling was not satisfied, but could not reply. On arrival, I found the letters were in none of my pockets. On returning, I found them on the hall table, where they had been placed a moment, putting on my gloves. The other day, I had to go see a patient in Folkestone, in Shakespeare Terrace. I got there very late, and did not stay, but drove down to the pavilion for the night, it being dark and rainy. Next morning at 11 I walked up to find the house, knowing the general direction, though never having walked there before. I went up the main road, and after passing a certain turning, began to feel a vague uneasiness coming into consciousness that I had passed the terrace. On asking the way, I found it was so, and the turning was where the uneasiness began. The night before was pitch dark and very wet, and anything seen from a close carriage was quite unconsciously impressed on my mind." Professor Kirschner says, "Our consciousness can only grasp one quite clear idea at once. All other ideas are for the time somewhat obscure. They are really existing, but only potentially for consciousness, i.e., they hover, as it were, on our horizon, or beneath the threshold of consciousness. The fact that former ideas suddenly return to consciousness is simply explained by the fact that they have continued psychic existence, and attention is sometimes voluntarily or involuntarily turned away from the present, and the appearance of former ideas is thus made possible." Oliver Wendell Holmes says, "Our different ideas are stepping stones. How we get from one to another we do not know. Something carries us. We, our conscious selves, do not take the step. The creating and informing Spirit, which is within us and not of us, is recognized everywhere in real life. It comes to us as a voice that will be heard. It tells us what we must believe. It frames our sentences, and we wonder at this visitor who chooses our brain as his dwelling place." Galton says, "I have desired to show how whole states of mental operation that have lapsed out of ordinary consciousness admit of being dragged into light. Montgomery says, "We are constantly aware that feelings emerge unsolicited by any previous mental state, directly from the dark womb of unconsciousness. Indeed, all our most vivid feelings are thus mystically derived. Suddenly, a new, irrelevant, unwilled, unlooked for presence intrudes itself into consciousness. Some inscrutable power causes it to rise and enter the mental presence as a sensorial constituent. If this vivid dependence on unconscious forces has to be conjectured with regard to the most vivid mental occurrences, how much more must such a sustaining foundation be postulated for those faint revivals of previous sensations that so largely assist in making up our complex mental presence?" Sir Benjamin Brodie says, "It has often happened to me to have accumulated a store of facts, but to have been able to proceed no further. Then, after an interval of time, I have found the obscurity and confusion to have cleared away, the facts to have settled in their right places, though I have not been sensible of having made any effort for that purpose." Wundt says, "The traditional opinion that consciousness is the entire field of the internal life cannot be accepted. In consciousness, psychic acts are very distinct from one another, and observation itself necessarily conducts to the unity in psychology. But the agent of this unity is outside of consciousness, which knows only the result of the work done in the unknown laboratory beneath it. Suddenly a new thought springs into being. Ultimate analysis of psychic processes shows that the unconscious is the theater of the most important mental phenomena. The conscious is always conditional upon the unconscious." Crichton says, "Our conscious life is the sum of these entrances and exits. Behind the scenes, as we infer, there lies a vast reserve which we call the unconscious, finding a name for it by the simple device of prefixing the negative article. The basis of all that lies behind the scene is the mere negative of consciousness." Maudsley says, "The process of reasoning adds nothing to knowledge in the reasoner. It only displays what was there before, and brings to conscious possession what before was unconscious." And again, "Mind can do its work without knowing it. Consciousness is the light that lightens the process, not the agent that accomplishes it." Walstein says, "It is through the subconscious self that Shakespeare must have perceived, without effort, great truths which are hidden from the conscious mind of the student. That Phidias painted marble and bronze, that Raphael painted Madonnas, and Beethoven composed symphonies." Ribot says, "The mind receives from experience certain data, and elaborates them unconsciously by laws peculiar to itself, and the result merges into consciousness." Newman says, "When the unaccustomed causes surprise, we do not perceive the thing and then feel the surprise, but surprise comes first, and then we search out the cause. So the theory must have acted on the unconscious mind to create the feeling, before being perceived in consciousness." A writer in an English magazine says, "Of what transcendent importance is the fact that the unconscious part of the mind bears to the conscious part such a relation as the magic lantern bears to the luminous disc which it projects. That the greater part of the intentional action, the whole practical life of the vast majority of men, is an effect of events as remote from consciousness as the motion of the planets." Dr. Schofield says, "It is quite true that the range of the unconscious mind must necessarily remain indefinite. None can say how high or low it may reach. As to how far the unconscious powers of life that, as has been said, can make eggs and feathers out of Indian corn, and milk and beef and mutton out of grass, are to be considered within or beyond the lowest limits of unconscious mind, we do not therefore here press. It is enough to establish the fact of its existence, to point out its more important features, and to show that in all respects it is as worthy of being called mind as that which works in consciousness. We therefore return to our first definition of mind, as the sum of psychic action in us, whether conscious or unconscious. Hartman calls our attention to a very important fact when he says, "The unconscious does not fall ill, the unconscious does not grow weary, but all conscious mental activity becomes fatigued." Kant says, "To have ideas and yet not be conscious of them, therein seems to lie a contradiction. However, we may still be immediately aware of holding an idea, though we are not directly conscious of it." Maudsley says, "It may seem paradoxical to assert not merely that ideas may exist in the mind without any consciousness of them, but that an idea or a train of associated ideas may be quickened into action and actuate moments without itself being attended to. When an idea disappears from consciousness, it does not necessarily disappear entirely. It may remain latent below the horizon of consciousness. Moreover, it may produce an effect upon movement, or upon other ideas, when thus active below the horizon of consciousness." Leibniz says, "It does not follow that because we do not perceive thought that it does not exist. It is a great source of error to believe that there is no perception in the mind but that of which it is conscious." Oliver Wendell Holmes says, "The more we examine the mechanism of thought, the more we shall see that anterior unconscious action of the mind that enters largely into all of its processes. People who talk most do not always think most. I question whether persons who think most, that is, who have most conscious thought pass through their mind, necessarily do most mental work. Every new idea planted in a real thinker's mind grows when he is least conscious of it." Maudsley says, "It would go hard with mankind indeed if they must act wittingly before they acted at all. Men, without knowing why, follow a course for which good reasons exist, nay more. The practical instincts of mankind often work beneficially in actual contradiction to their professed doctrines." The same writer says, "The best thoughts of an author are the unwilled thoughts which surprise himself, and the poet, under the influence of creative activity, is, so far as consciousness is concerned, being dictated to." A writer in an English magazine says, "When waiting on a pier for a steamer, I went on to the first, which was the wrong one. I came back and waited, losing my boat, which was at another part of the pier, on account of the unconscious assumption I had made that this was the only place to wait for the steamer. I saw a man enter a room and leave by another door. Shortly after, I saw another man exactly like him do the same. It was the same man, but I said it must be his twin brother, in the unconscious assumption that there was no exit for the first man but by the way he came, that by returning." Maudsley says, "The firmest resolve or purpose sometimes vanishes issueless when it comes to the brink of an act, while the true will, which determines perhaps a different act, springs up suddenly out of the depths of the unconscious nature, surprising and overcoming the conscious." Schofield says, "Our unconscious influence is the projection of our own unconscious mind and personality unconsciously over others. This acts unconsciously on their unconscious centers, producing effects in character and conduct recognized in consciousness. For instance, the entrance of a good man into a room where foul language is used will unconsciously modify and purify the tone of the whole room. Our minds cast shadows of which we are as unconscious as those cast by our bodies, but which affect for good or evil all who unconsciously pass within their range. This is a matter of daily experience, and is common to all, though more noticeable with strong personalities. Now we have given much time and space to the expressions of opinion of various Western writers regarding this subject of there being a plane or planes of the mind outside of the field of consciousness. We have given space to this valuable testimony, not alone because of its intrinsic value and merit, but because we wished to impress upon the minds of our students that these out of conscious planes of mind are now being recognized by the best authorities in the Western world, although it has been only a few years back when the idea was laughed at as ridiculous, and as a mere dream of the Oriental teachers. Each writer quoted has brought out some interesting and valuable point of the subject, and the student will find that his own experiences corroborate the points cited by the several writers. In this way we think the matter will be made plainer, and will become fixed in the minds of those who are studying this course of lessons. But we must caution our students from hastily adopting the theories of Western writers, advanced during the past few years, regarding these out of conscious states. The trouble has been that the Western writers, dazzled by the view of the subconscious planes of mentation that suddenly burst upon the Western thought, hastily adopted certain theories which they felt would account for all the phenomena known as psychic, and which they thought would fully account for all the problems of the subject. These writers, while doing a most valuable work which has helped thousands to form new ideas regarding the nature and workings of the mind, nevertheless did not sufficiently explore the nature of the problem before them. A little study of the Oriental philosophies might have saved them and their readers much confusion. For instance, the majority of these writers hastily assumed that because there was an out of conscious plane of mentation, therefore all the workings of the mind might be grouped under the head of conscious and subconscious, and that all the out of conscious phenomena might be grouped under the head of subconscious mind, subjective mind, etc., ignoring the fact that this class of mental phenomena embraced not only the highest but the lowest forms of mentation. In their newly found mind, which they called subjective or subconscious, they placed the lowest traits and animal passions, insane impulses, delusions, bigotry, animal-like intelligence, etc., etc., as well as the inspiration of the poet and musician, and the high spiritual longings and feelings that one recognizes as having come from the higher regions of the soul. This mistake was a natural one, and at first reading the Western world was taken by storm and accepted the new ideas and theories as truth. But when reflection came and analysis was applied, there arose a feeling of disappointment and dissatisfaction, and people began to feel that there was something lacking. They intuitively recognized that their higher inspirations and intuitions came from a different part of the mind than the lower emotions, passions, and other subconscious feelings and instincts. A glance at the Oriental philosophies will give one the key to the problem at once. The Oriental teachers have always held that the conscious mentation was but a small fraction of the entire volume of thought, but they have always taught that just as there was a field of mentation below consciousness, so was there a field of mentation above consciousness as much higher than intellect as the other was lower than it. The mere mention of this fact will prove a revelation to those who have not heard it before, and who have become entangled with the several dual mind theories of the recent Western writers. The more one has read on this subject, the more he will appreciate the superiority of the Oriental theory over that of the Western writers. It is like the chemical which at once clears the clouded liquid in the test tube. In our next lesson, we shall go into this subject of the above conscious planes and the below conscious planes, bringing out the distinction clearly and adding to what we have said on the subject in previous books. And all this is leading us toward the point where we may give you instruction regarding the training and cultivation, the retraining and guidance of those out of conscious facilities. By retraining the lower planes of mentation to their proper work, and by stimulating the higher ones, man may "make himself over" mentally, and may acquire powers of which he but dreams now. This is why we are leading you up to the understanding of this subject step by step. We advise you to acquaint yourself with each phase of the matter, that you may be able to apply the teachings and instructions to follow in later lessons of the course. Matram. Affirmation. I recognize that my Self is greater than it seems, that above and below consciousness are planes of mind, that just as there are lower planes of mind which belong to my past experience in ages past, and over which I must now assert my mastery, so are there planes of mind into which I am unfolding gradually, which will bring me wisdom, power, and joy. I am myself, in the midst of this mental world. I am the master of my mind. I assert my control of its lower phases, and I demand of its higher all that it has in store for me. End of section 19. Recording by Marian Servasi.